Welcome back to our study of Pentateuch. We're going to finish up our study in the book of Numbers. We're considering the theme God's Army in the book. Here's Warren Wiersbe's book on Numbers. I like his title, Be Counted, because that's what they did 2 times in the book of Numbers. They made a census twice. But of course, Wiersbe is saying be counted for the Lord. Look what he says. This is in his introduction. It is interesting to note that the nation did not grow during those wilderness wanderings. In fact, the second census showed 1,820 fewer men of war. The nation wasted 38 years, endured unnecessary afflictions, failed to grow, failed to honor God, and all the while they were on their death march. That is what unbelief does to Christians. It wastes time, effort, and manpower and brings no real blessing. So we want to avoid that. And he concludes how sad it is when churches fail to step out by faith and as a result start to degenerate spiritually, numerically, and materially. So this is a warning. This is a practical book, of course. All scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable. We want to profit from the book of Numbers. So we started looking at the old army. It was trained at Mount Sinai, chapters 1 to 10. The old army marched to Kadesh Barnea. Beginning in chapter 11, really, chapter 10, if we go to verse 11, chapter 10, 11, and it came to pass. You remember that I've mentioned this several times. That is a grammatical clue to tell us, okay, this is a new scene or this is a new episode. Well, this is a big new episode. This is where they leave Sinai, where they have been 1 year. And it came to pass on the 20th day of the 2nd month in the 2nd year that the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle of the testimony. So the cloud's lifted. That means they can move forward. But Israel kills time for 40 years. And their judgment is one year of wandering in the wilderness. For every day that they were in that, searching out the land of Kadesh Barnea. So that's a pretty hefty punishment there. But we see the consequences of disobedience. So what happens? Well, it goes downhill from here. They're on the march, it goes downhill. Beginning in chapter 11, you have the 7 murmurings. Israel had murmured before, right after the crossing of the Red Sea in Exodus 14. And so now we see this being carried on. So there is a murmuring about food. Chapter 11, 1. They complain about food. Israel has been complaining for 1 year. We saw that back in chapter 10, verse 11. This complaining displeases the Lord. Look in chapter 11, 1. And when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and his anger was kindled. New Testament, James 5:9, very simple. Do not complain. Okay, so this is part of human nature. Complaining is ingratitude. God had provided them, verse 6, manna. All they had to do is just gather it up and fix it into a meal. They didn't have to go out and work. They just had to go gather it up and prepare a meal. And their complaining affected it actually affected Moses. Moses begins to complain. in chapter 11. It's interesting how our actions affect others and others' actions affect us. Philippians 2:2, Paul said, fulfill my joy. Make my joy full, Philippians. Just think about that. Let that soak in. Make my joy full. In other words, they could contribute to making Paul have more joy. And of course, we know people can take away joy, but our joy is not dependent on circumstances. We know that. But even the Apostle Paul says to the Philippians, affect my joy. So they murmured about food. They murmured about their leaders. This is chapter 12. This is where Moses' brother and sister rise up against him. They murmur against God's will. You look at the last verse in chapter 12 there at Paran. That's halfway to the promised land. And this is where Moses sends out the 12 spies. We know that story. 10 come back with a negative report. Joshua and Caleb say, we can take it with the power of God. And then you have in chapter 16, you have murmuring about authority. This is Korah, chapter 16. This is Korah, who is a Levite. But he rises up and he starts complaining against Moses' leadership. He's saying he has too much authority. He is an antagonist, we could call him. There are books written today on antagonists in the church. These are not just critical people. These are not just negative people. These are activists against the pastor. Just like Korah was an antagonist and an activist against the leadership of Moses. And I mean, God came down hard. 250 of those who sided with him were put to death. But then there's a murmuring about that judgment of God. Chapter 16, verse 41. But on the morrow, all the congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron, saying, you have killed the people of the Lord. So, I mean, this is what God did. Moses didn't do it. So it is inevitable that we're going to have criticism, we're going to have antagonism, which is a level above criticism. And we have to have the humility of Moses to handle it. It is inevitable. So just get ready. Numbers 16, verse 46. And Moses said unto Aaron, Take a censer and put fire therein from off the altar, and put on incense, and go quickly unto the congregation, make an atonement to appease the wrath of God. So we know from the New Testament, Romans 3 and Hebrews 9, where that word is translated atonement or propitiation in Romans 3. And in Hebrews, it's translated mercy seat, because that's where the blood was applied and God's wrath was satisfied, or God was propitiated. And so that's what happens here. Murmuring like their parents in chapter 20. So most of the first generation is passed on, but look what the children are doing. They are following in the footsteps of their parents. Chapter 20, verse 1. Then came the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, unto the desert of Zin in the first month. And the people abode in Kadesh Barnea. Miriam died there and was buried. And again, verse 2. And there was no water for the congregation. So they begin to complain, just like their parents. And so look what happens. Look in verse 8. God says to Moses, take the rod and gather you the assembly together, you and Aaron, your brother. Notice, speak to the rock. So 40 years before this, when they came out of Egypt, they were complaining, and God said, strike the rock, and he did. And that was a type. According to 1 Corinthians 10:4, that was a type of Christ. Christ the rock, 1 Corinthians 10 says, was smitten by God. But he does not need to be smitten twice. So here, Moses is commanded to speak to the rock. But Moses is angry. I mean, he's been putting up with this stuff for decades. He's angry. He strikes it. And so not only does the older generation not go into the promised land, but neither does Moses get to go into the promised land. And so we see the children following the sins of the parents. There's that murmuring about the food that we just mentioned. Chapter 21, verse 5, there's no bread. Okay. Back in chapter 20, that they were murmuring there about no water. But in chapter 21, they're again, notice, they start out murmuring about food, and they end up murmuring about food. Chapter 21, verse 5. And again, God punishes them. He punishes them by allowing the fiery serpents to go throughout the camp and to bite them. But then God, in his mercy, says, Moses, put a brazen serpent on a pole, and if they look in faith, they can live. So here's another type. How do we know these are types? I mentioned the striking of the rock. We know that's a type because it is referred to in 1 Corinthians 10. So we know this is a type because it's referred to in John 3, verse 14. Even as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Those are types when they are referred to in the New Testament. In spite of victories over the Canaanites in chapter 21, 1-4, Israel sins, and God graciously gives them more victories upon their repentance. So in 21, we see that they defeat two kings, Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, the king of Bashan. So they're getting ready for this battling in the land of Canaan. God is getting them ready. But then we have the ultimate rebellion in chapters 22 and following. And here you have them in Moab. So, okay, you following these geographical places. Look in chapter 22, verse 1. And the children of Israel set forward and pitched in the plains of Moab on this side Jordan. So they are right at Jordan River. They cross Jordan, and then they will be in the promised land. They are in Moab. So they'll stay here 4 or 5 months. But this is where the king of Moab looks out. He sees this multitude of Israelites. He is frightened, and he tries to hire this false prophet, Balaam, to pronounce curses on the people. 5 messages that Israel... But what does he do? He gives 5 messages that Israel is blessed by God. So here's a blog post that I've written on this subject. I get my title from J. Vernon McGee. He called them prophets for profit. And he told this story of a pastor who came to his wife and said, I've gotten a call to a church in the next town. It's a larger town. It's a better church. The people in it are far more refined and cultured, and they do not cause the trouble they do here. And they offered me a higher salary. I'm going upstairs and pray about pray about this to see if it's the Lord's will for me to go. His wife says, fine, I'll go up and pray with you. And the pastor says, oh, no. You stay down here and you start packing. And J. Vernon McGee says, we have prophets for profit today. And that's who Balaam was. And so you can read this. This just gives more details about the prophet Balaam. So let's study about him just a little bit. Israel is at Moab, chapter 22:1. They've been there for 5 months. The last 5 months of the 40th year. So here's the plight. We mentioned it. The king of Moab is frightened. So he invites Balaam to come and pronounce these messages of judgment, these curses. So here's a question. Was Balaam a false prophet? The Old Testament never calls Balaam a prophet or a seer, but a divine soothsayer in Joshua 13:22. Balaam sought omens to understand the future by divination, according to Constable on chapter 22:5. So he was really not a prophet, but he was being used in the sense of a prophet. God gave him prophecies. So Balaam was Balaam a believer? So there are many indications in the narrative that Balaam genuinely feared the Lord. He seems to have been sincerely sympathetic with the Israelites, even praises them in chapter 23:10. The New Testament passages, however, such as Jude 11, indicate that Balaam was not a believer. So there's some debate there. So Balaam is on this journey, and he's having these encounters with God, and God gives him messages, gives him instructions. But then you remember Balaam and the donkey that spoke. So we know that Satan enabled a serpent to speak in Genesis 3. So God enabled a donkey to speak in Numbers 22:28. You can read that episode there. Chapter 22, verse 28. And so what's going on? Well, God is going to use this donkey to speak what is truth to Balaam, who is also going to be overruled by God and speak the truth. So the oracles. Now we begin to see his oracles. You have the preparation for them in chapter 22, verse 36. He's getting his divination material together. But the first oracle is in chapter 23, verse 7. Chapter 23, verse 7. And he took up his parable and said. So look at this. Look at the message. I cannot curse what God has blessed. Takes us all the way back to Genesis 12, where God says, I will bless them that bless Israel. His second oracle is in chapter 23, verses 13 to 26. What's the message there? I cannot curse what God has blessed in the past. His third oracle is chapter 23, verse 27 into chapter 24. I cannot curse what God has blessed and what he is going to bless. And then you have this in this fourth oracle, which has to do with the future. He refers to the coming star, which perhaps is Christ in his first coming, and the scepter, pointing to Christ's second coming. You remember Jacob blessed Judah and said, the scepter shall not depart from you, that is your descendant, and Christ was a descendant of Judah. The fifth is the seventh oracle, which forecasts the future. So in all of these, God overruled and refused to allow Balaam to curse his people. Again, the grace of God is being displayed here because they were murmuring and they were rebellious. So Balaam's messages could not curse Israel, but his practice did. This brings us to this big chapter of Numbers 25. As God was pronouncing his ultimate blessings on Israel through Balaam on the heights of Peor, below in the plains of Moab, Israel was performing her ultimate rebellion. This is another a repeat of Exodus where they worship false gods. Chapter 25, 1-6, Balaam defeated Israel by getting them to sin with the Midianites. So we know that's the sin because in chapter 31, verse 16, it is laid out that was the sin. Chapter 31, 16, behold, these caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to commit trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor, and there was a plague among the congregation of the Lord. But here you see Phinehas. This is a descendant of Aaron. He rises to the occasion. Phinehas possessed what Balaam did not, zeal to practice God's word. So this is when he takes his spear and he puts to death one of the Israelites who's committing adultery with one of the Midianitish women. In other words, he's practicing that Leviticus 18, which said these sins of Canaan are capital crimes worthy of capital punishment. So all this is happening up here in Moab, but you have the Midianite women brought up. And that's how Balaam defeated Israel, not through his messages, but through his influence. So the new army is equipped, beginning in chapter 27. Okay, so a new successor is chosen. That would be Joshua, chapter 27 and verse 12. Joshua is the successor. The new generation is instructed, beginning in chapter 28. So here you have a repetition of the laws for the new generation. Keeping the Sabbath, all the different burnt offerings, the first fruits, the trumpets, the tabernacle, the Passover. And then the new army defeats the enemy in Transjordan. This is in chapter 31. Transjordan is east of Jordan. This is before they cross Jordan into the promised land. And so here you have a new army settles in the east side. This is Gad, Reuben, and the half tribe of Manasseh. But it's always cast in a bad light. And so why did they settle there? They settled there because it was good land for their cattle. It was a great place to raise cattle. But someone said it was not a great place to raise children. And so they failed to move into the promised land because of the material prosperity, the material benefits. So in chapter 33, is the new army reflects back and is challenged to move forward. Chapter 33, you have 42 locations Israel traveled in the 40 years that are listed specifically. And so why did this happen? This list constitutes a memorial to the grace and faithfulness of God in thus far fulfilling his promises to the patriarchs. It is a reminder of God's care of his people. It would have been a great encouragement as the Israelites looked forward to taking the final step into the promised land, Thomas Constable says. So here's these all these 42 locations that are mentioned in chapter 33 begins up here with Ramesses when they came out of Egypt. Chapter 33, verse 3. And they departed from Ramesses in the first month. And so it goes all the way to when they were at Kadesh Barnea. So all of these locations are listed. But then, in chapter 35, the new army must execute justice in the Levitical cities. So there's a total number of towns allocated to the tribes of Levi that's spread throughout all of Canaan. Because Levi, you remember, were the full-time servants. They did not have a plot of land like each of the other 12 tribes. So they are spread out. And then 6 of these cities for the Levites were called cities of refuge. And you see three on the west side, 3 on the east side. These are cities of refuge. These were sanctuary cities, not for criminals, but for the innocent, those who had accidentally killed someone. Not intentionally, accidentally. They had a place where they could flee. And then in chapter 36, justice is also provided for the daughters of one of the leaders who died. The leader died, and those daughters were not married. And so God said, let's be fair. Let's let them have part of the inheritance, but let them marry within the tribe. And so justice is the way the book of Numbers ends. So let's think about the benefit of Numbers regarding the Israelites and our entering into all that God wants us to enjoy. Everything depends on one's attitude toward God. So we've seen the attitude of the old generation, the new generation, the old army, the new army. If we allow the giants and the walls that stand between ourselves and God's will to block our view of God, we will fail. Unbelief will lead to disobedience that will lead to discipline that will lead to frustration and death. We all have obstacles. Israel faced giants in the Canaan land, in Canaan, the promised land, but they failed. David faced a giant. He faced giant Goliath and the Philistines, but he trusted God, defeated that obstacle to God's will, and he moved forward. This is Thomas Constable, and he says, however, if we see the giants and the walls overshadowed by God, as Caleb and Joshua did, we will succeed. Trust will lead to obedience that will lead to blessing that leads to the progress and life. And Hebrews 4:11 refers back to this, challenging us. Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall through following the same example of disobedience. So we have these examples, and some of the examples are negative, but we should learn from their mistakes. So from Numbers we learn that God has his army. He had his army in the Old Testament, it was Israel. He has his army in the New Testament, that is the church, 2 different entities. But we are armies. We are soldiers of Christ. Therefore, put on the whole armor of God.